Welcome everyone. If you're a student, go ahead and just sign in, put your name in the chat, and then you can put your question in. We'll wait just a second until people kind of start populating and coming in. I want to say thank you to our sponsors today. We are graciously sponsored by the College of the Arts at Cal State University Fullerton, as well as the Grand Central Arts Center. This is part of the Teaching and Socially Engaged Artists Series. We're indebted to the Art Education Program at Cal State Fullerton for pulling this all together, and the Association of Historic Curators for their support as well. Thank you so much for being here today. We're here to welcome Huynh. Huynh is a Los Angeles-based artist and educator whose practice is primarily in drawing, painting, and public art. Her work explores cultural perception and representation. Huynh challenges beauty standards by constructing images of the Asian female body vis-a-vis plastic surgery to unpack how contemporary cosmetic surgery can create obscurity in cultural and racial identity. Her current work of drawings on pink donut boxes explores the complexities of the refugee experience in Southeast Asian communities. Huynh has had solo exhibitions at the Gauguin Gallery in Beverly Hills and the Sweeney Art Gallery at the University of California, Riverside. Her paintings and drawings have been exhibited nationally and internationally in countries such as Germany and Cambodia. She has also completed public art commissions for the Metro Orange Line, Metro Silver Line, and the Los Angeles Zoo. Huynh is a professor of art at Los Angeles Valley College, and served as the chair of community-based art for the Prison Arts Collective Advisory Council, which advises a vital program of California State University San Bernardino, which is now actually statewide. It's at San Diego State and Fresno State and Cal State Fullerton, all over the place. She completed undergraduate coursework at the University of Southern California, received her Bachelor of Fine Arts degree with a distinction from the Art Center College of Design in Pasadena, and received her Master's degree of Fine Arts from NYU. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much. I'm really bummed that I can't be there in person to meet you all and see your faces, and these kinds of invitations. That's the part that I enjoy most. So thank you. And thank you for that fancy introduction. So I guess I'll start by sharing my screen, yeah? Okay. So that's my baby picture, you all. So thank you again for having me. I'm really excited. I'm a strong believer in public education and the Cal State system. I am a Vietnamese refugee of Chinese and Cambodian descent. I was born in Vietnam, and my family and I had to leave our home country because of war and genocide and violence. So what you're looking at is my first baby picture, which is a mugshot at a refugee camp in Thailand. And these are my parents. My father is Cambodian, and he left Cambodia because of genocide and the dictatorship of Pol Pot, and he had no choice but to leave. And he got on his bike and literally rode until he hit the Vietnam border, and that's where he met my mom. So here you see my mom on the right. She's of Chinese descent. So my grandparents, her parents, left China during World War II because of Japanese occupation, and they eventually settled in Vietnam, where both my mom and I were born. So in the 70s, my dad got a boat, took my mom, me, all our family, and hid us under the boat floor, and we escaped and left to Thailand, where there was a refugee camp, and eventually resettled in the United States. I talk about this first because that experience is really traumatic for my family and myself, and it's informed my identity here in the United States. And because of this experience, my identity in the United States has been really scrutinized and politicized, and my process in becoming American has been very controversial. I always like to share this quote in talking about double consciousness. Because of my refugee experience, there's this duality that I have to struggle with, in which W.E.B. Du Bois, the great W.E.B. Du Bois, in his book, The Souls of Black Folk, talks about double consciousness. And I just want to read this very impactful quote from his book. And he says in it, "It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. And this quote really resonates with me, this like, again, duality and double consciousness, constantly trying have to negotiate how I see myself and how others see me. So me being introduced to W.E.B. Du Bois is much attributed to my mentor. From the age of 16, this is my mentor, Charles Daly. He's a Vietnam War veteran. He's an LA-based artist and educator. He's really like my second father. And I feel that for a young person as a teenager to have a brilliant, strong, outspoken, African-American as my mentor really changed my life. He gave me the agency to speak my mind and introduced me to artists of color, to understanding the Black experience, and really decentering whiteness in my education and my cultivation of being an artist. So I owe a lot to him for that. And one thing that sticks to me, going back to W.E.B. Du Bois' idea about double consciousness, Mr. Daly always told me, hey, you need to know your shit and their shit. And it's really true. And it took me many years to figure out exactly what he meant. I mean, in addition to going back to my roots and my culture, but navigating, how people see me and how I see myself, but also that our larger educational structure and art institutions center on whiteness, like that's the norm, right? And so I have to learn that system and other cultures and areas that the system does not recognize. So that's really important to me. Another important piece that influenced me in my work is Edward Said. And Edward Said was this brilliant scholar. He taught at Columbia University. He's also a refugee. He's Palestinian, and his family had to relocate to Lebanon. But in 1978, he published this book called Orientalism. And for an Asian American person, this work resonates with me completely. It talks about this double consciousness, but it also talks about othering and exoticizing, right? Marginalizing people. There is no Orient, right? That's a very derogatory term. The Orient is not a place, but it is of the imagination. And Edward Said asserts that it is from the white European imagination creating this other body, these Asian bodies. So all of that really settled into my process and research and thinking. So the first part of my career was about making art, about navigating cultural displacement and assimilation and stereotype. And this body of work I called Disorientation, again, nodding to Edward Said's scholarship on Orientalism, but also about perspective and place, complicating, how I see myself, how others see me, and how this whole process can be literally dizzying and disorienting. So this is a painting from that series of work. It's called Sweet and Sour Pork that I did in 2009. And again, it's complicating and confronting stereotypes about Asians, right? So sweet and sour is a sauce that's not authentically Chinese. It's made up here in the United States. And the year that I painted this painting, it was the golden year of the pig. So I thought that was kind of funny. And what kinds of images pop into my head when I'm thinking about these kinds of stereotypes, right? This large pig with Siamese twins kind of suckling on this pig. But these babies, these quote unquote Chinese babies, are plump like the pig, and they're stereotypical in their corporal depiction, like the long ponytail and the frontal lobe kind of shaved, right? This idea of pigtails. So I'm playing off of a lot of Chinese stereotypes. And so what I want to talk about is, where do these stereotypes come from? These are cartoons that were published in the United States during the latter part of the 19th century. In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act was enacted to prevent any Chinese laborer from immigrating to the United States. So this was the first blatantly racist legislation in the United States to blanketly outlaw a specific ethnic group from coming. And so you have these cartoons like the Chinese must go, no Chinese need apply, but looking at how they're racialized and stereotypes in these cartoons, I confront that in my work. In that painting that I just showed you, I talked about Siamese twins, right? who's the first Siamese twins? And where does that term even come from? It came from this image. So what we're looking at is a photograph of Chang and Eng Bunker, who are ethnically Chinese, but they were born in Thailand. And during the 19th century, Thailand was referred to by the West as Siam, hence their name, the Siamese twins. They were born conjoined at the chest. And when they were about 17 years old, an American captain who was in Thailand saw them and tricked them into signing a contract and basically took them around the world as part of his traveling freak show. So it was important for me to show you those influences so you can see how it informs my work. A lot of my paintings are laborious, like I take a lot of time thinking and making about them, but it comes from like intense research, which is very important. So as I mentioned in my work that deals with disorientation, I play with stereotype and duality. So if you come from a certain cultural perspective, you would see some things and you wouldn't see others. This is a painting that's called Live Long and Prosper. Again, the titles harken back to like Asian stereotypes. And on the far left, you see the Chinese god of longevity. This god, a lot of times he has this like misshapen forehead and he would hold a peach. And a peach in Chinese culture represents long life, right? So, but if you're in the West and you don't see that perspective, a peach can be sexualized and it's actually a symbol for the vagina. And then his head now becomes like this big phallus, right? So here I'm just like playing with those different kinds of interpretations. So that work kind of paved the way for my more recent work about plastic surgery on Asian female bodies. And I call this body work Pretty Hurts, you know, alluding to cosmetic surgery, but more importantly, its process in whitewashing female Asian bodies and how it informs how body image is sort of constructed. So what you're looking at is a billboard in the city of Rosemead that I saw about a few years ago. And Rosemead is a city in the San Gabriel Valley where there's a lot of Asians. There's a high Asian demographic. And I find billboards are very strategically placed, right? Billboards are placed in areas where they're advertising to that clientele or to that demographic. In this case, it's Asians, right? So this was an advertisement for plastic surgery. And in the center, you can see like the before and after image, right? So before you have this Asian woman with smaller monolithic eyes, a wide face, darker skin, a flatter nose, and a wider jawline. And then her transformation after plastic surgery is lighter skin, double-lidded, wider eyes with blue contacts, right? And a more angular, narrow face. And for me, these kinds of advertisements are very problematic. So in addition to looking at these advertisements on plastic surgery, there are mechanisms and cosmetic tools that mimic plastic surgery for Asian women. So the image on the left is a nose roller. So you see this Asian woman rolling her nose. And that is a mechanism that's supposed to make your nose taller and narrower and sharper, right? But to contrast that on the right is an advertisement where the model is not Asian, but is white. So if this is intended for an Asian person to buy, what this person is looking at is a white model. Like that's somebody he or she is supposed to aspire to look like, which I find to be, again, very problematic. So from that, I created this painting called Nose Sharpener. Playing with language is a big part of my work. And this is an oil and collage painting that I did in 2016. So here you have a nude, you know, Chinese woman sharpening her nose. But if you look at her foot, it's misshapen and very small. Because I referenced Chinese feet binding in this piece. So Chinese feet binding is a 1,000-year-old practice in which the standard of beauty is to have very, very small feet. And the process is very grueling. And in some ways, I feel like it's the earliest form of cosmetic surgery. You have to break the bones on the feet, wrap it really tightly to make it small and not grow. And the ideal size is 3 inches. So I wanted to like contrast the small feet, small eyes, small breasts of pre-colonial standards in Chinese beauty canons with what's going on today. But I didn't want it to be complacent. Like I wanted to have a little bit of resistance. So I have her kind of like smoking a cigarette while she's like sharpening her nose. Okay, another thing that comes up in changing body image for Asian women is skin bleaching. And in my conversations with community members, these kinds of standards are not only for Asian women, but you can see this in like Latinx communities and like African American communities, you know, like straightening your hair or lightening your skin, right? So on the left here, again, you see an advertisement for a whitening cream, and you have an Asian model, right? One side is completely white and the other side is darker. And these advertisements are very strategic. And you can see that most of her face is white because that's what she wants to be, right? And then to contrast that, you have another advertisement for a whitening mud mask on the right. And you have a white woman with blonde hair, blue eyes and fair skin. But again, it's not meant for white women, it's meant for women of color to lighten their skin. So I used that and I created this painting of a beauty queen in 2016. And you can see that, you know, her skin tone is mimicking or kind of referencing that porcelain white doll, you know, look of bleaching your skin. She has a tiara, she has a sash, and she's crying and her mascara is running. We don't know if she won or she lost. But the impetus for this painting came from a high school picture of a Korean beauty queen that went viral because she had plastic surgery and somebody found her high school photo that was like pre-surgery, and people were making fun of her and saying like, look how ugly she is. And so the inspiration for this painting came from that story. In a lot of my work, I fuse Eastern and Western modes of painting and complicate those modes. So you'll see like allusions to isometric perspective and graphic qualities with like rendered ways of looking at form. In this painting in the garden, I wanted there to be some sort of battle between like Asian women who've had plastic surgery, trying to convince a woman who hasn't to become like them. So you see these two women with sort of this tan Barbie doll, you know, skin tone with blue eyes and red lips and breast augmentation, you know, really violently making this woman become like them. A very popular procedure on Asian women, particularly Far East Asian women, is blepharoplasty. And that is a procedure where you cut the eyelid, remove the fatty tissue, and re-sew it so that you create a double lid to make it look wider. But again, if you don't have money for plastic surgery, not that I'm advertising, there are these funky products like eye tape, like this one. So you can see on this, on the left side is the monolided eye, and then you see an arrow pointing to, hey, if you use tape, look how beautiful your eye can be, you know, bigger with a double lid. Or there, and I swear to God, I am not making this up. These are things that I found, right? This one is an eyelid trainer, right? For just 5 minutes a day, every day, if you wear this, you can train your eyes to look bigger, right? And so there are images here of the eyes on the right and how like it can transform to be bigger. But again, what's problematic is, you know, the white model with blue eyes and fair hair and fair skin. And like, look, you can look like her, you should aspire to look like her. So because of that research, I started making 3-inch drawings alluding to the size of the ideal bound foot and just catharting, like just drawing the research. You know, I made like 100 of these drawings. So you can see here on the left, like this perfect double-lidded eye, and on the right, the procedure that I was talking about, blepharoplasty, and like reconstructing the lid on Asian bodies. And in a lot of this research, there's a lot of like before and after, and I wanted to exaggerate that sort of process. So on the left side, you see a pair of eyes before surgery, and on the right, after surgery, but really exaggerating that process and even making the eyes look artificial and robotic. And something to think about, these procedures are very violent. I mean, plastic surgery is a very violent act on your own body. You're bleeding, you know, you're being cut, you're being sutured, you bruise. And so in my research, I came across this selfie of a Vietnamese American woman who's undergone blepharoplasty, and I just couldn't take my eyes off of it and started drawing it, you know, and reckoning with the tape and the suturing and the bruises on her face. Another question that I really think about in making this body work is, how much of these canons are self-imposed, right? How much is it imposed on yourself? And how much is it society putting those pressures, right? So in this drawing, I have this woman, performing blepharoplasty on herself. So where am I at now? The last 4 years have been really difficult since this presidential administration, and it's really galvanized people to take action and to activate and to resist, right? You notice a lot of my work did not make anything about my refugee experience or immigrant experience whatsoever. For a long time, I didn't want to, because I felt like my parents were so traumatized and that trauma was passed down to me, that what's the point of making art about that? Like, is it commodifying it? Is it doing it any justice? But it wasn't until this administration and just seeing how anti-immigrant it is, children being caged and separated from their families, that it really made an impact on me, that I'm going to make work about this now and share this very traumatic experience about my family and my art to be in solidarity with what's going on in our southern border. So I started making work about the refugee experience and resettlement, like focusing on anti-immigrant xenophobia, anti-Asian racism, and the last 4 years has been the highest rate of deportations of Cambodian and Vietnamese refugees and immigrants. So as Professor Pomonis mentioned, I started making drawings on pink donut boxes. So for those of you who know, in California, about 90% of the donut shops in California are owned by Cambodian refugees and immigrants. And part of that story came from a man named Ted Ngoy. In 1975, he left Cambodia because of war and genocide, and he resettled in California. He worked multiple jobs, and one day a coworker gave him a donut, and he's like, "Oh my God, what is this? It's delicious," right? And then he decided he wanted to open a donut shop. He saved money. He became a manager at Winchell's. It kind of, incorporated that training and bought his donut shop and saved money and bought another one, and then created this system of opening up donut shops and giving jobs and leasing donut shops to Cambodian refugees as they were coming to the country. So that's why we have so many Cambodian-owned donut shops here in California. But what's also unique about these donut shops is they use pink donut boxes, and that is tied to the Cambodian refugee experience. The legend goes that one of Ted Ngoy's workers at the time, before these pink donut boxes, is all like white donut boxes, right? His worker called up the donut box distributor and asked, do you have anything cheaper? Because it was all about being resourceful and saving money, right? And the company said, well, red ink accidentally fell and dyed all these white cardboard pink. If you want them, I can give you them for cheaper. And then we have all these like pink donut boxes, right? So Voodoo Donuts in Portland, you totally ripped this off from us, right? So here I drew a picture of Mr. Rogers, and the reason why I drew him is because when my family and I first came here, we learned to speak English by watching TV. So my grandparents and parents and I would sit in front of the living room and watch Mr. Rogers. And y'all, that is very impactful to see him, because Mr. Rogers, if you've ever seen him, is very like mellow, patient. He has this aura of compassion almost, and there's really traumatic experiences of, people telling my family, like, go back to where you come from, speak English. So like to be able to watch this white man, be very patient in teaching us English is kind of a big deal. And I distinctly remember him always saying, like, won't you be my neighbor? And that is a very important question now, during a time when it's such an anti-immigrant environment that we're living in. So I started interviewing and finding friends and community members who share this experience of being Southeast Asian refugees. And this is of Mei Li Tao. Mei Li Tao is the niece of the Donut King Ted Ngoy, who I was talking about. But her parents had a donut shop, and she grew up after school doing homework there. A lot of these kids of immigrants and refugees would, go to the donut shop and do homework and help out. And she did that. But like a lot of immigrants and refugees, her parents wanted her to have a better life. So they wanted her to go to college and like really pursue a viable career that she wanted. And she did. You know, she went to college in San Diego. She was pursuing a career in like journalism and news broadcasting. And when she was done, she decided, I don't want to do that. I want to go back to the donut shop and rebrand it. And she did. You know, she made it contemporary, got it Instagram, you know, brought cronuts and like ube donuts, you know, made it really hip. And I really love that story because a lot of children of immigrants don't really go back to their parents' businesses, right? But in this series of work, I didn't want to perpetuate the model minority stereotype of Asians, right? We're not all good at math. We're not all good at being successful business people, you know, especially for Southeast Asians who are refugees, there's a lot of trauma. So a lot of refugees who've resettled with parents who are silenced and can't talk about their trauma, and they're working all the time. A lot of kids that I grew up with had to fend for themselves and lived in neighborhoods that had high gang violence and were underserved. So it was not uncommon to know a lot of my peers who eventually became pregnant teens or joined gang life because they had to defend themselves, right? That's the story of Chef T, and his birth name is Visop Uk. He's a child of Cambodian refugees, and you know he fell into that pattern. You know, he became a gang member. Not that he wanted to, but that's what was around him. And his older sister died on her birthday, and he decided, I can't live like this anymore. I want better. I want better for me, for my family. I want to be a better example. So he put himself through culinary school and became a chef, and still goes back to his community to help. So with these series of works, I wanted to show those stories, like those uncommon stories, right? Because I feel like this country perpetuates the American dream and silences those on the margins. So DJ Honey is also a Cambodian refugee, and I love her story. You know, she's a DJ, she loves hip hop. She's a phlebotomist by day and puts herself through school. By night, she's like this awesome DJ, but she's also queer and had a traditional Cambodian wedding and has a wife. Like that's not very common, right? And she also started a nonprofit supporting Cambodian queer communities. And again, I just want to acknowledge that beautiful story. And I also want to point out in these series of works that there is a distinct difference between a refugee and an immigrant. You know, an immigrant decides to leave their home country, right? Whereas a refugee has no choice but to leave their home country because of violence or because it's just not viable. It's just not, they can't survive. And so I feel like that really needs to be clear when we're talking about immigrant policies. So I started these series of cross-stitch license plates, right? And I wanted to acknowledge California as a very specific place of immigrant society and community. It's very different than anywhere else in the country. But also I did these pieces because I don't have an anglicized name. I made a conscious choice not to change my name. Like my name can be just as American as Bob or Joe, you know? But I could never find my name when I went to Magic Mountain or a gift shop. Like I could never find my name, and some of you may relate to that. And so I wanted to acknowledge everyone who has non-anglicized names and to take that stance, not to change that name. So I did one of Rithi Pan as well. Rithi is a Cambodian filmmaker who resettled in Paris. And again, just acknowledging his name. You know, your name is very powerful. You have a lot of agency through who you are and your identity in your name. But what I also love about these names is the reinvention of names, right? So you either change your name to an anglicized name, you keep your name, or, you know, why not reinvent your name and play with spelling? And I feel like DJ Honey does that, and I really love her story. Okay, so where am I at now? As I mentioned, a lot of us are activating ourselves in resistance, right, within the last 4 years. So for me, in addition to just like making art and following the traditional ways of showing them in museums and galleries, education is really important. I really value my role as an educator, but also as a social activist. I help out with the BLM movement here in South Pasadena, where I live. I serve on committees that help our disproportionately impacted students. I also was active in the Prison Arts Collective. So as an artist, it's not just about making art, but it's not enough. Sometimes you have to do more than that. So I want to talk about, finally making art about activism and resistance. And this is a piece I call Resistance Matriarch that I did in 2019. And it's just that. It's about confronting patriarchy, about giving women power, about giving aunties power, and mothers power, and your titas, your tias power, that kind of thing. And here, I have an image of a Chinese matriarch clearly with her gesture, like telling, hey, F off. Like, I'm going to be in control here, And the particular image I use comes from this photograph of a woman from the 19th century with bound feet. So during this time, a lot of Western photographers from Europe and America were going to China, making these women sit down and pose for them, right? To produce these photographs to show, look at these women, look how weird they are. And so in the painting, I wanted to give her back her power and say, I'm not going to sit for you, and this is who I am. I think one of my most important works in activating resistance and feminism, fighting patriarchy and white supremacy, is my collaboration with Rocky Rivera. I'm a mom too, in addition to being an artist and educator, I'm a mom, and those three roles are really important to me. Rocky Rivera is a Filipina rap artist from the Bay Area. Like me, she wasn't born here. She was born in the Philippines and came to the United States at 4. So a lot of her work deals with cultural assimilation, fighting stereotype. But as I mentioned, our values are very similar. We're pro-BLM, we're anti-racism, we're anti-gentrification. We very much embrace social and racial justice values. So I approached her. I'm like really inspired by her music, and I said, let's make art together. Let's fight together. And one of the first collabs we did together was I did the album cover for Rocky's Revenge that she did in 2018. And this for her was an album about, not aligning with this president, like fighting white supremacy, fighting patriarchy and decolonizing. And when we talked about the artwork for this album, at first, because being a Filipina, there's this history of Spanish colonialism. She's like, Phung, I really want this image of a Spanish conquistador beheaded. And I said, well, that's just kind of pandering to that kind of patriarchy. Why don't we call upon like a really strong matriarchal, female deity? And we thought of Kali Ma, right? This mother goddess, mother universe, but also destroyer, right? Like she can create and she can also destroy. And when there's deep darkness and evil, she comes to destroy that and regenerate and gives liberation. So here I've painted Rocky Rivera as reimagined as Kali Ma with the heads of the Proud Boys, right? And so it's really blatant where we stand. And also some background, Cambodian culture is really, it springboards, its foundation is Indian culture. Indian culture and religion is the foundation of Cambodian culture. Also, Rocky Rivera, her birth name is Christine de Leon, because she was born in December, and her father, though he was Filipino, he followed this Indian philosopher, J. Krishnamurti, and named Rocky Rivera after him. A lot of activism and resistance isn't just about, it's about fighting and standing up, but it's also about celebration. So I wanted to show this piece because this is a piece that I did with Self-Help Graphics, which is an amazing, amazing arts nonprofit that really serves the community in Boyle Heights. And I was invited to make prints that would promote the census, but more importantly, promoting the census to advocate for marginalized communities, immigrant communities and community of color and low-income communities, to tell them that, hey, our voices count, make sure you fill out the census. And so here, that's what I did. And a lot of times I don't paint random people. I paint people I know, people who are aligned with my values. So you see in the front, that's Sergio Taran. He's like a brother to me. He's a Latinx artist, and he's also an educator. I have Dr. Sherry Rodriguez and Dr. Yanet Martin, who are deans at my college, who support our DACA students. I have my partner and my kid. So this was really a celebration of these communities, of our communities, and how much we matter, and we do count. And I was really honored that that print was used as a billboard in Northeast LA. And I really consider myself a Northeast LA girl. That's where I culturally identify. And to remind our communities that, hey, let's make sure we are heard and that we count. So I know that was a lot, but I just want to give you a sense of what I do as a practicing artist. And then how do I use that in teaching? And what's ironic is when I teach, I never talk about my art whatsoever. My focus is like all about my students, you know? But my practice in teaching is really through a social and racial justice lens. And that's really important to me. I teach at a community college, right? And I love that because anyone can come. Anybody's welcome to get higher education. I teach at a community college where most of our students are students of color. However, the faculty are not. I work in an environment where the faculty are mostly white, students are mostly of color, and I feel like that needs to change because then our students are not seeing themselves in their teachers. And that's really true in my art department. Although I have to say, I'm really lucky that in my art department, I am the only person of color, but most of my colleagues get it and are willing to actively listen and are aligned. But it's still optically problematic when our students are coming to the art department and like, I'm the only person of color and I'm not even Latinx and Black, right? We need more Black and Latinx faculty members. And there are enough of them. They just need to be hired, right? So I want to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion through a social justice and racial justice lens in teaching. And here I'm showing you a catalog from the art department at my college. And this is just the art history course offerings alone. And you can see that the majority of this centers on Eurocentric paradigms, right? You have the history of Asian art, and then you have the history, the arts of Africa, Oceania, and ancient America. That's a large part of the world just crammed into one course, right? That are not necessarily culturally aligned. And then the rest, you know, Survey of Art History 1 and 2 and Modern Art, all of these are mostly art history courses that are Eurocentric. We're trying to change that, but I feel like it's important to acknowledge that. So at LA Valley College, I used to teach art history and art appreciation, but now I mostly teach drawing and painting. And art appreciation, I feel, is a very important class because most people take that class when they want to learn about art, right? And most of the time it's very Eurocentric, it's problematic, right? It should encompass all kinds of art. So when I teach art history or art appreciation, I often show a map, right? We know the world is round, so we can slice it anywhere when we make it a map. And I ask my students, you know, look at this world map. What's in the middle? And everyone's like, Africa, yay, Africa, right? Yeah, I wish that education centered on on African experiences more, but they don't. And I point out that no, Europe is in the middle, right? And a lot of how we learn is institutionalized to center on Europe. Y'all seen Black Panther, right? This is one of my most favorite scenes from the Black Panther in 2018. And here you have the actor Michael B. Jordan at the British Museum of Art, and he's confronting the curator, right? Looking at all these amazing African artworks and telling her these were stolen. And it's true. It's really true. A lot of these museums and institutions acquired artworks through exploitation and through colonialism. So I take all of that and I use that to make my students aware. And I'm still learning, I'm still in the process of decolonizing, right? This is the book that we use at our college to teach art appreciation. And this book, like many books, art history textbooks, use artworks that are in the collections of European American museums and art institutions. And that just perpetuates the legacy of colonialism. So what I do with my students is when we look at the textbook, I don't just assign readings, but we analyze the structure of the book. And one thing we point out is asymmetrical representation. In this book, there are 9 chapters devoted to art history. Of those 9 chapters, 6 are devoted to Western art and 3 to non-Western art. In this book, culture is completely misrepresented. So there's cultural misrepresentation in this book. For example, in one chapter, there's this one chapter on the art of Africa and Pacific Islands. You know, why are those two, you know, clumped together? That's kind of like the miscellaneous chapter, right? So that's very problematic. Another question I ask my students when we look at this book is what matters, what counts? And what I have them do is I'll assign a student a chapter and make them count all the images in that chapter. And in chapter 1 alone in this book, there are 22 images, 21 are Western artworks, and only 1 is non-Western. And that's very problematic. Last but not least, these books create the illusion of arrested development for non-Western cultures. So in these books, when you look at art from Africa and Asia, they stop before the modern period, right? And in this book, in the Asian art section alone, it doesn't go beyond 1800s. It doesn't go beyond the 19th century. Whereas Western art is given a more comprehensive survey going from prehistoric to now. So in analyzing the book, I just wanted to give you a breakdown. Indian art stops at 1000. Art of China stops at 1360. Art of Japan stops at 1833. And then art of Southeast Asia, which is really only Cambodia, stops at the 12th century. That's 1100s. And doing that is highly problematic. It creates the sense that there's no progression in these cultures. So that's pretty heavy, right? In addition to teaching art history, I use all of that in my studio classes as well. And I teach painting and drawing. And in my painting class, and this I remember too from when I was a student, a lot of my instructors would assign a master copy, right? Maybe some of you have had that before in your art classes where you select a work by an artist and you copy it and you study it by replicating it. So I do that in my oil painting class. But before I do that, I ask my students, what is a master artist? What is a master painter? And give me examples of who those artists are. So I would go around the classroom and gathering like 3 artists from every student and make a master list on the board. And always, it never fails. Most, right, at least 85%, if not more, of the artists that we've assembled are dead white men. And then what we do is we reconstruct a list of master artists that's more inclusive. That includes women, that includes LGBT plus artists, that includes artists with disabilities, artists of color, right? So these are some sample student paintings. The one on the top left is a master copy of Kehinde Wiley, the African-American artist who painted President Obama. On the bottom left is a painting study of Hokusai, the printmaker from Japan during the 18th century. And then you have on the right, a study of Artemisia Gentileschi, the Baroque painter from Italy during the 17th century. Another important class that I love to teach is figure drawing, life drawing. And in this class, one of my first assignments that I like to assign on the first day is I'll have all my students imagine a nude model in their heads and then draw that model. And then when they're done, I'll bring out the model and have them draw the model from observation. And the point of that assignment is to analyze when we draw from our heads and what we draw from what we see. And when we draw from what we see, it becomes more quote unquote accurate and representational. But in this exercise, I found in a classroom where most of my students are students of color, and when I ask them to imagine an art model and draw that model, most, I would say 9 out of 10, if not more, of the students are drawing white models. So again, it's problematic that my students can't even see themselves in their artworks. So this is a drawing by a student in which the model here is Ji Tiao. He's a pretty well-known Asian art model. He's modeled at Fullerton before. But these exercises are really important in unpacking, right, racial and social justice. I also teach anatomy in my figure drawing classes. We learn about bones and muscles, but I also wonder, like, where are we getting our knowledge of anatomy? And I ask my students that, right? Like, how do we know what our bodies look like on the inside, the muscles, the bones, the organs? You know, of course, it's through dissection, right? But the question is, where are we obtaining these bodies? And I talk about the history of anatomy, and that a lot of this, especially in the 18th and 19th centuries, when there were so many medical schools in the United States, enslaved African American bodies were used as cadavers. And a lot of these bodies were stolen from tombs. So this is an image of a graveyard called the Mount Zion Cemetery in Washington, D.C. In the 1800s, in the 19th century, major medical schools used corpses from enslaved bodies, and these were acquired by this underground market of dead bodies. This whole phenomenon was called the body snatching industry, which provided cadavers to medical schools in Harvard, the University of Maryland and Pennsylvania, and even Virginia, right? And in some instances, medical students themselves, because there weren't enough cadavers in these medical schools, in the middle of the night would go to the cemetery and would excavate and take bodies of recently buried African Americans for dissection. I know this is very heavy, like these are very heavy topics, but I also think it's very important. But part of teaching from a social and racial justice lens is also celebrating my students and their heritage. So an assignment that I like to assign is reinventing the superhero. And I got this idea from a friend of mine, Dr. Adeli Funama, who teaches African American studies at Loyola Marymount University. And he tells me, and he's written books about this, as a young Black child, it was hard for him not to find Black superheroes. I mean, there was the Falcon, right, and the Panther, but overwhelmingly, a lot of superheroes were white men. So I assigned this project for my students to reinvent their own superhero, and this is one of my favorites. This is a student who's Mexican American, and she wanted to honor her Aztec heritage. And I love it for so many reasons, you know, acknowledging indigenous culture, acknowledging her heritage, but also herself as a female Aztec warrior. I love that. But one of my most favorite assignments for my students is a zine about themselves. So before they produce the zine, I would give them a questionnaire and ask them, where were you born? When were you born? What happened on the year you were born? You know, how did you get your name? What does your name mean? How did your family come to the United States? Are you indigenous? Are you descendants of enslaved Africans? You know, how did you all end up here? And the stories that unfold from all of my students, and this is like really hard for me because I can't even see them right now, right? Because we're all on Zoom. It's such a privilege for me to be able to hear their stories. And they would make zines, they would photocopy them, and at the end of the semester, they would trade them with each other. So everybody leaves with this beautiful story of each other. And I give them freedom to use any medium they want, any style they want. And these are like really, really impactful stories. And it's important because I tell my students, you have to write your own story. Don't wait for somebody else to write it for you. So since we're talking about teaching and engagement, I just want to end with an important quote from my hero, Toni Morrison, you know, the great author who died a couple years ago. And I teach through this. She says, I tell my students, when you get these jobs that you have been so brilliantly trained for, just remember that your real job is that if you are free, you need to free somebody else. If you have some power, then your job is to empower somebody else. This is not just a grab bag candy game. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. It's amazing. I mean, I really appreciate how well organized your presentation is, and then how centered you were on, or how centered you are, not just in your practice with social justice, but in your teaching practice, that those two things fold together so seamlessly. It's just really, it's an honor to listen to you speak. I'd like to ask some questions that the students have put in the chat, and I'll definitely identify them for you so you know who you're talking to.
I see you all. Yeah,
I'm going to turn off. I'm going to stop my video so that I'm not lagging. Am I lagging a little less now? That's good. Okay. Let's see. How many years did it take for you and your family to gain U.S. citizenship? This is from Alejandra Matus. What were some of the obstacles and struggles for you to reach that status? And did women in your family ever fall victim to advertisement and using the products that you focused on in terms of those beauty ideal?
You broke up. I hope everyone can hear me. Those are very good questions. I just want to acknowledge that when my family came here, it was a different era. In the 70s, you know, the government felt responsible for what was going on in Southeast Asia. So Americans were more willing to bring us in and to help us. That's not the case today anymore. You know, that was a very specific time. So it took my family really quickly. We got residency almost immediately. I didn't get my citizenship, even though I came to the United States since I was 1.5. I didn't get my citizenship until I was 19. And part of it was my parents were like, we're too busy working. You can get your own citizenship when you're an adult. You know what I mean? But as soon, I tell everybody, you know, if you can, get your citizenship right away, because you need to vote. You know, everybody who lives here needs to have that power to vote. To answer the question about women in my family, yeah, I remember one summer. It's so crazy. I have cousins in Miami. So like, this is kind of the running joke. I have adopted Mexican culture because like we're in LA, right? So I really embrace like Mexican culture. My cousins in Miami embrace Cuban culture. So we'd go there every summer and we'd get so dark. And I'd come back to LA and all my family members are like, why are you so dark? You know? And so that's problematic, right? And a couple of my cousins had nose jobs. And my mom even said growing up, if, you know, after high school, if you want your eyes to be bigger, you know, you can do that, you know? And I'm like, yeah, sure. But, you know, that's kind of screwed up, you know, and it's really screwed up for your parents to say that. So in a way, resisting those beauty standards is a stance, right? So yeah, some of these things are like really super personal.
Yeah, it's always amazing to me. I remember working with teenagers in high school, and a lot of times their parents would offer the girls that for their graduation present instead of offering them tuition for college. And it was always heartbreaking to me to see that internalized self-hatred and I always felt it's just terrible for them. And it's one of those things that I think as women, we can, across cultures we experience, but, you know, I think if you add the lens of cultural communities that are trying to be white, in addition to that, it's just really an intense amount of pressure on young girls.
Absolutely.
This is from Jocelyn. When working with younger children, how can we leave them with a message of loving themselves and not needing to change to feel accepted in society? This is from Jocelyn.
Oh my gosh, very good question. And I know that because like I'm a mom, right? I have 2 cisgendered boys. So one thing is like not passing down the trauma that was passed on to me to my kids. But being very open. Number one, you have to be age appropriate. I'm sorry, right? Like we can't expose our young folks to everything. They need to like love living and be kids and just play, right? So you need to give children space to play and explore. So that's the lens that I like to educate younger folks, is through not telling them what to do, not telling them how to draw, but explore. So a lot, I mean, since we're talking about art, a lot of like elementary school age kids, you don't tell them how to draw, you let them explore. You give them paint, you give them colors, and you allow them explore. Same thing through social justice lens, right? And again, I say it more through as a mom. I try not to like tell my kids how to be. I always tell them, you know, at the end of the day, I'm trying to raise you to be independent and confident so that you can create your own path. I'm here to support your path, right? And so something would come up and I always, well, how do you feel about that? What's your opinion on that? And we start there. Always start with exploration, always start with questions, and then guide them through the conversation. And that's, let me tell you, that's so important because that's not how I grew up. You know, how I grew up, like, this is how it is, you know, period. And I'm trying to undo that for the way I educate and the way I raise my children. I think we lost Professor Pomonis. So she's texting me right now, y'all. So I'm just seeing what she's saying. So she said, my connection dropped. Can you answer the questions in chat? Okay, I'm gonna do my best. Okay, so I'm gonna go up in chat. So Jasmine Flores, nice to meet you. She says, what is your favorite piece of art that you have created thus far? Why is it so meaningful to you? That's a heavy question. It's like telling me who's my favorite student. You know what I mean? Okay, if I had to choose, Jasmine, it would be the resistance matriarch, like flicking the bird. I mean, that's where I'm at right now, to be honest, with just so much going on right now. That right now is my favorite. It may change over time. Kelly Dow, I think you're a fellow Viet, welcome. You asked, how has culture impacted your art? I think I went through that a lot, you know, throughout the talk today. Culture to me is your language, it's your way of life. It's how you interact meaningfully with your community. So for me, that's how it's impacted my work, is thinking about where I came from and how can I use my experience to connect more deeply with other people. And I'm sorry if I mispronounced your names, everybody. So Rose Maldonado, what do you hope people feel when they look at your art? Thank you for that question. I hope people feel empowered. I mean, my art isn't for everybody, I know that. But I hope when people look at my work, they walk away feeling empowered about themselves, that they can make a difference, that they are proud about where they come from and where they're going. And hopefully where they're going would be out of a place of empathy and compassion for other people as well. Hi, Professor Pomonis.
Hi, I'm sorry my internet connection is unstable. I'm so happy that you're rolling, and I lost all the chat questions because I dropped off. So I'm just gonna follow you right now.
Okay, great. Thanks for the moral support. Okay, gee, I hope, next question. Okay, Roland Castaneda asks, what do you consider when making public art that you may not include in personal work? Roland, that's a very, very good question. Public art is very different because you can't make whatever you want. And technically you can't. When there's a public art project, you have a panel you have to answer to, you have a project manager you have to answer to. So you technically, even if you wanted to, cannot do that. So you will see, I didn't get to show my public art today, but my public art is very different than my personal studio practice. In my personal studio practice, I feel more liberated and I'm just gonna say what I'm gonna say. But when I'm making public art, I research the neighborhood. I have to be aware, you know, of who am I making this art for? This art isn't just for me. This art is for the people I'm serving, the community I'm serving. So that's very, very important. So community engagement is important. Getting feedback from the community in which this public art is gonna live is really important. And then Keely Nicholson asks, thank you for coming, thank you for inviting me. These are my questions. Number one, what do you hope to do next with your art? And number two, how did you begin your career in art? And how did you know you wanted to use your art for social justice? That's a very good question. What do I want to do next with my art? I'm getting older. And I feel that my platform now is to support the youth. I feel like I've hustled long enough, you know, I've done enough, and I've created this platform in which I really want to support the next generation of artists, whether that's mean through helping my department hiring, whether it means, I mean, people all the time, you know, like email me, like just showing up, writing recommendations. But my next step, of course, continuing my practice in the studio, is to support the next generation of artists. So your next question, how did you begin your career in art? How did you know? I didn't always know I wanted to do social justice in my art. I always kept it separate, you know, because I always felt, how can art even command and like distribute and advocate for social justice? That was just within the last 5 years that I was more blatantly expressing my social justice lens in art, because I didn't want to be tokenized as a political artist. I think that was the problem. So I always kept that separate, but in my practice and voting and how I mother and how I educate and how I protest, I kept that separate. And it's only now that I'm able to merge those two. Megan High asked, what do you do when you have a creative block? It happens. I'm sorry. If you think you're immune to it, I'm sorry. It is going to happen. And why are we blocked is because we live in a capitalist culture that treat artists like machines. We're pressured to produce, right? Like meet deadlines, produce something that can be consumed. And so for me, a block is not a block. It's self-preservation. A block is like, I need some space right now because it's too much. And one of my great mentors, Robert Shapazian, told me, it's not a block. It's like hibernation, right? It's like cocooning. So you think of it that way. When you like feel, oh my God, I'm blocked. It's not that you're blocked. You're cocooning and you're regenerating to be ready to create again, right? So that's one way to look at it. At least that's what I tell myself, so. Okay, April Robledo asked, which of your pieces do you enjoy making the most? Wow, that's like the other question, which is your favorite? It's just different. I'm sorry, painting is different than drawing, is different than sewing, right? But you bring up a good point, April, in that it's very important to enjoy the process and not look at making art as, this is something I have to do. It shouldn't be frustrating, but no matter what, it's really important to find value and to find, joy in making art.
Can I jump in for just a second? I have a question just
Sure.
out of curiosity. So I know you've worked with lots of different kinds of communities. You've worked with high school, you worked with college students, and you've also worked with the students through the Prison Arts Collective. Can you talk a little bit about how it's different to design work for communities like the participants in the Prison Arts Collective versus designing curriculum for teenagers or college students? What are some of the different things that you take into consideration with different audiences?
That's a great question. And you already know this, I know you teach this in your classes too, is that you have to ask a lot of questions and survey what the needs are in the community you're serving. I approach teaching not as like, I'm the professor and I know it all and I'm going to share knowledge. I really look at teaching as a service. I'm serving my students. It's a civic obligation, right? Lovingly for me. So I feel like you need to do the research, learn about the community you're serving, ask lots of questions, ask what they want. You can't go into a community and like, I'm going to teach you how to paint in oil. Well, maybe they don't want to, just like for young folks or whether you're teaching in the prison system, you need to ask them first what they want, right? And work from there. I think that's important. Do we have time for more, or I'm on your time?
Well, I think that's a pretty good place to stop. You answered a lot of questions. I just want to thank you for being so patient with us, and even with a little technical difficulties. It looks like we have one more question, and then we'll wrap it up. This is Edith. What motivates you to continue to create more pieces of artwork? What motivates you every day?
To feel alive, like I really honor life as an energy and as a privilege, not only my own, but those who I come across. If I stop making art, then why am I living? You know what I mean? So we all find ways to value and understand why we're here. So what motivates me is really, contemplating what stages in life I'm at and making work from there. And ironically, a lot of my work is also about transforming suffering. I'm Buddhist, and a lot of my practice is about understanding that everybody suffers, everybody goes through challenges, but it doesn't stop there because the suffering really connects us to each other and how to transform this into something more than what it is.
That's such a beautiful sentiment to end on. I just want to thank you so much for being so generous with your time and sharing your beautiful work with us and answering all the students' questions. It's such an honor to interview you or just to listen to you and be in the virtual room with you in this space. Thank you so much for coming to visit today.
Thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you all. I hope to meet you one day in person.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.